All right, welcome back everyone to KeyShot World 2020 Virtual Edition. Again, I'm Derek Cicero. Thank you for joining us. If you missed our prior session, it was a great session on materials with Kareem and Soren. They kind of went over the overview of how Cutaway works, Tune, Shader, Material Graph. Great presentation, so recommend checking that out. If you missed it, they are back now. Thank you to Soren for coming and giving us kind of a technical deep dive on some of how the real world materials inform the virtual counterparts. He's going to be here again today to talk about RealCloth, so thank you to him. As a reminder, as always, any content is on the agenda page, so if you go onto our agenda page, you can grab it from there and pull it down. As I mentioned, today is materials, so 2 sessions on materials. Coming back tomorrow to talk about model sets and studios, and bringing it back on Wednesday with 2 sessions on lighting. So please join us for all of those, either live in person or follow up on YouTube. Speaking of which, one thing that kind of has come up in the Q&A a lot is people kind of want more information to kind of deep dive in some of these topics. Reminder, if you go to our website, on the top bar it says resources. From there you click on learning. There's a whole host of information out there. There are videos on animation, on rendering, many of which we've updated for KeyShot 9. Throughout the KeyShot 9 lifecycle, we're continuing to be updating some of the older information, like things on Material Graph. But please, if you need more information, I cannot recommend enough, go to resources learning. Also can click the manual from there. We've been updating the manual with every release of KeyShot from 9.0 to 9.1. So there's a wealth of information out there for folks who are looking for it. I want to talk a bit about the Render Weekly contest. As I mentioned, at the end of today, at the end of the Q&A, I'm going to show the 3 finalists. So we have 3 finalists, and then at 3 p.m., Render Weekly is going to post the winner. Which of those 3 finalists gets the KeyShot Pro license? Reminder, we'll have another contest. Again, people are asking how to participate in the contest. If you go on renderweekly.com or Render Weekly's Instagram page, you can see basically you render your image, you throw it on Instagram, you tag with RW KeyShot World, the tag on there, and then that's it. You're submitted. You're in. And then we'll, like I said, we'll pick 3 finalists and then pick a winner next Monday for the second contest. So I'll show more information at the end of the session today. Speaking of other prizes, we had the Craftsman drill today, the DeWalt walkie-talkie, courtesy of the wonderful people at Stanley Black & Decker, longtime KeyShot users they are. So thank you to them. Again, at the end of the second Q&A, we'll go through that. And so with that, we're going to jump into today's session, which is utilizing RealCloth, Fuzz, and scan materials in KeyShot with Kareem Merchant and Sorrel Gallenmark. So gentlemen, please take it away.
All right. Thank you, Derek, and good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me. Welcome all, and thanks for dropping in on this afternoon's RealCloth and Fuzz workshop. My name is Kareem Merchant, and I'm one of the creative specialists here at Luxion, based out of our Orange County, California headquarters. If you weren't here earlier, this is for you. If you were, I'm sorry you have to hear this again. A little bit about myself. I'm a recent industrial and product design grad from Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. Since graduating, I've worked as a freelance industrial designer and most recently as a creative specialist here at Luxion. I'm sure many of you have been longtime KeyShot users. I myself started using KeyShot just after KeyShot 6 release and have adopted it as my product viz program of choice. With my current position, I've had the good fortune to be able to dive into KeyShot and spend a significantly higher amount of time with the program, and I'm always blown away by just how much customization and flexibility it's provided me. I know many of you are curious about the desktops we use here in the studio. We have a beast of a machine from Main Gear. It's running an AMD Ryzen Threadripper 2990WX with 32 cores at 3 gigahertz. It has a NVIDIA Titan RTX GPU on board and 128 gigs of RAM. It's running Windows 10 Pro as well. And if you're looking for a render rig, definitely stop by Main Gear's website and take a peek at what they have to offer. On that note, let's jump in our workshop. Today, we're going to be talking predominantly about RealCloth and Fuzz, 2 of our newest features, which I found incredibly fun and useful to explore. We'll discuss some of the similarities and differences between them and take a deep dive into controlling each of the materials. I'll also spend some time talking about our new Unwrap UV feature, as well as how it plays a role in successful RealCloth applications. We'll look at 2 common scanned material outputs and talk about how you can acquire them through KeyShot Cloud as well as third-party resources. And finally, we'll wrap up discussing how to use multi-materials and as KeyShot Viewer with configurators in XR. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer and demo solutions at the end of the presentation. In the meantime, we have a few of our Luxion team members in the Q&A panel to help answer and direct questions you have, so feel free to fire away. And with that said, let's jump into our Tech Talk segment with one of our lead software engineers, Soren Galmark. Take it away, Soren. Introduce yourself.
Thank you, Karim. So let me just grab the screen. Yes, so as Karim was saying, I am a software engineer at Luxion, and I'm working on KeyShot. And recently I have taken part in the development of the RealCloth material. So I'm going to discuss what makes cloth special and why RealCloth is needed in many of the use cases. And maybe you didn't realize some of these things, but it's good to have a keen eye when you look at cloth. So let's first have a look at a very interesting piece of cloth. It's a silk type cloth. So I rendered basically the same material. So on the left, you see a silk rendering, and on the right, you see a silk rendering. The difference is that on the right, the weave pattern is rotated 90 degrees compared to the left. And you can see they look actually quite different. And this is an example of anisotropy. The materials look significantly different when you look at them at different directions. And it also shows another feature of silk, which is a little bit hard to see, but if you look at the left image in the lower right, you can see there is actually 2 highlights where you would normally expect to only see 1. And this is also a special feature of silk. And I will get back to that in a moment. First, I'm just going to show you 2 more examples. Here I have twill on the left, where I added these flyaway fibers or flyaway pieces of the yarns that stick out of real fabrics. And it really helps add this softness to the fabric. And actually Fuzz came more or less as a side effect of our research into cloth. So we thought we might as well ship out a geometry node that could do basically the same thing, but with more flexibility. So that's how you got Fuzz. And on the right, you can see a satin. So satin is a different kind of weave, which has longer, flatter segments of yarn. And it gives you a much smoother, softer highlight. And again, the material properties on the image to the right is more or less the same as the material properties on these ones. And it's only the weave 3D geometry of how the yarns are placed that makes the difference. Or it's actually, or more, it's what makes the largest difference to the appearance. So have a very close look when you go and look in the store at different types of weaving patterns and how they reflect light. Especially velvet is interesting because that actually only reflects light at grazing angle. So try to look at it the next time you're in a shop. But let's take a closer dive into some fabrics. So here are some close-up shots of some different weaving patterns and different types of yarn. What's worth thinking about here or noticing here is that it's particularly clear on the green one, at least, that there are basically 2 types of yarn. There is the round flat yarn, which is basically a bundle of twisted fibers that are very straight. And then you have the more ribbon-like yarns, which are these bands of fibers, textile fibers that follow along and are bended around the round ones. And this is also pretty clear on the satin to the far right, that you have these ribbon-like yarns and you have these long, thin, round yarns. What you can also see in these images is that the position of the highlight depends very sensitively on how these yarns are placed relative to each other, and also the shattering and occlusion effects of each of the yarns against each other. And the fact that the highlight can vary so much depending on where you shine the light can give rise to this split specular highlight or off specular peaks that I was mentioning for the silk. So it basically means that normally when you, to take a contrast, if you take a piece of rough metal and you shine a light directly down onto it, the light will bounce straight back. It's of course being reflected roughly at the same exit angle at the entry angle if you tilt the light, but at normal incidents it gets straight back at you. But for cloth, it's typically slightly different. You also get these sideband highlights that you can see I highlighted with arrows here. And I actually was fortunate enough to find an example of this recently, so I took an image as fast as I could. And here you can see a lamp. And you can see these two split highlights to the right. And if you look carefully, you can see there's a small highlight at the bottom, which is only a single highlight. So this shows you that there's only a single light source here, and this is actually the sun outside this room. And the bottom one is a typical rough material, which shows a single highlight, but you see these very clear anisotropic highlights, which are very elongated, and two of them at the same time. And you will not be able to get this on, like, for example, a standard plastic material in KeyShot and in other software packages. But you can do this with RealCloth. But let's take a slightly closer look again at yarns and the weaving pattern. So here I zoomed down even further, and you can really see the individual textile fibers here. And what you will notice is that the individual textile fibers are actually very, very shiny. And if you were present in the last session, you will know now that a rough metal or a rough material you can describe essentially as a collection of small mirror-like facets, which are perfectly shiny. And it's actually much the same with cloth. You have a bunch of small textile fibers, which individually can be quite shiny. But when you look at the aggregate behavior of all of them taken together from afar, the cloth itself can appear much less shiny than from up close. So the material model or the appearance model we use for the Fuzz generated curves are actually based on how other scientists have investigated textile fiber scattering. So let's have a look at that. So if we simplify things a bit like we like to do in physics and computer graphics, let's imagine that a textile fiber is just a cylinder. And then some light hits the cylinder and is reflected off it. So there's typically, for textile fibers, two primary cones that are important. There's the specular cone, which is the cone that's basically reflected off the circumference of the cylinder. And then there's a transmitted cone, which is caused by the refraction of the light down two times through the cylinder. Of course, light could bounce around any number of times inside the cylinder, but for textile fibers, this is not so important. It's much more important for hair or fur. But if you look at like a Fuzz example here, I've taken some very ugly colors, but you can see the idea that if I apply Fuzz to our material ball and put a light straight in front of it, you will see almost only the green color reflected directly off the fibers. So that's almost always reflected straight back at the viewer. If you, on the other hand, put the light behind it, you will see much of the light transmitted red via this transmitted cone of light. So with these ingredients, and now we sort of understand how light scatters off a textile fiber, we can assemble this to create a model of how a full textile weave looked. So what we basically do is that we compute the aggregate behavior of all these textile fibers combined within a single yarn, depending on your viewing size. But the key ingredient that we're missing is actually how do the yarns actually look in 3D? Because some types of weaving patterns have a very tight weave pattern where the yarns are stretched tightly, and some have weaving patterns where they're less tightly wound. So we developed a very simple physics-based model for how to compute this. And that's what you actually do when you enter the edit weave pattern. It does a small physics simulation of how would these yarn look and lie in full 3D if you were to pull them at this strength. So that's what the tension means. It basically means that you pull it really hard or you pull it less hard. And depending on which yarns are over and under each other, you will get different tightness of the weave and different sections of flat yarns. And you can see this on the right, where we have a satin weave, which has this long section of flat ribbon-like yarn that's kept up by the small round yarns going below them, or the more silk-like weave where you have only two yarns, so the ribbon-like yarn has to really dip up and down at sharp angles. And these sharp angles are exactly what's giving you these split specular highlights or off-specular peaks. So what is the next step in RealCloth? The next step in RealCloth is to try to handle transmission. Of course, we already added small gaps inside the cloth that you see, but this omits all effects of light scattering off the edges of the yarns or going through the yarns and picking up color along the way. So here you see two images. So it's images of light being shone through a piece of textile. And you see the emitted light on the other side. So it's basically a backlight scenario. And what you notice here is that the transmitted light also has a super anisotropic structure. So on the right, you see this very long rectangular-like highlight, and on the left, you see a kind of a cross shape. And both of these is caused by the detail pattern of the weaving pattern. So on the right, you have a more satin-like or silk-like behavior. So you get these very thin, straight lines and these ribbon-like yarns that tend to really favor one direction very strongly. And in the left-hand side, you see something that's more close to a plane weave, where both directions are more or less equally important, but because there are still two very important directions, the up and down and the left and right, you get this cross shape for the transmission. And we've been working on getting this included in KeyShot and also to gracefully handle the front-back side thing, because right now, in order to do both the front and the back, you need to duplicate the surface. And I know some users have been having issues doing this in a convenient way. And I know for a fact that Magnus Schofield had the issue, so I borrowed one of his models. Thank you, Magnus. I will get back to the model from Magnus just in a moment. This is actually renderings from KeyShot that shows these transmission effects, where you can see we can actually reproduce this cross highlight, and we can reproduce this elongated highlight, depending on the weaving pattern. So now I get to the model from Magnus Schofield, sorry. And here you can see, you've probably seen this image because the images he's put up elsewhere is fantastic. But here you can see this is just a single sheeted mesh, and we can actually deal with the front-back difference. And you can also see these textiles are slightly transparent in a way that's much higher quality than what you can do with RealCloth right now. It's very apparent on the right-hand side image, where you can really see that one side of the cloth has much more red than on the other side of the cloth. And this is super easy to set up with a new technique that we hope to bring to you in KeyShot 10. And with that little teaser, I will leave the rest for Karim. And I need to stop sharing.
All right. That was awesome. Appreciate all that insight, Soren. It's always really interesting to hear what went into making all these incredible features. Hopefully that gave everyone a solid understanding of what makes RealCloth and Fuzz work and what makes it so unique to our industry. With that information at hand, I'd like to talk about how you can use RealCloth to augment your product biz workflows. Previously, procedural textures have served as the best way to create realistic cloth materials within KeyShot. Here you can see some examples of renderings made using procedural textures, which do a great job mimicking how cloth appears to the naked eye. Notice that many of these are pretty convincing, and they do a good job of evoking the appearance and feel of a woven material. However, at closer distances, the material may become less convincing depending on the type of material you're representing. Materials such as felts, wools, chenille, and cottons typically have characteristics such as errant strands or fuzzy surfaces that can't be accurately replicated using procedurals. You can see that between these two images here. Although procedurals can create realistic looking cloth materials, the complexity to achieve those results is significantly higher than when using RealCloth. Notice on this slide, I have two examples. The left depicts the setup of a procedural cloth material from a demo done by Esben Oxholm, the master of mood himself, versus the setup of a RealCloth scene, which can be seen on the right of the slide. There's a clear difference in setup difficulty between the two, with the RealCloth material essentially being a drag and drop application. Although RealCloth does make creating highly realistic woven materials incredibly easy, it also creates significantly heavier files. Typically, RealCloth will require much more computing power than using procedurals due to the complexity of created geometry. As Soren touched on, RealCloth replicates geometry of warp and weft fibers accurately rather than using a surface bump, so the spaces between the fibers are empty rather than just surface depressions that create the illusion of negative space. This is something you should definitely consider when creating scenes that require large amounts of fabric applied throughout. The ability to render them in an efficient manner will be entirely determined by your current hardware. On this slide, you can see a macro shot of a procedural weave on the top versus a macro of a RealCloth weave on the bottom. And notice that the RealCloth threads have dimensionality to them as well as flyaways, which help increase their believability as a RealCloth material. A moment ago, you heard me mention warp and weft. For those who are not familiar with traditional weave construction, warp and weft represent the two main components for creating a weave pattern. If you look at the image on the right of the slide, you'll notice a diagram demonstrating how a woven material is constructed. Here you can see the warp fibers are positioned longitudinally and are typically held stationary under tension during construction, while weft fibers are drawn through and inserted over and under the warp fibers. This is important to be aware of because the terms warp and weft are used within KeyShot to define which fibers receive adjustment when your parameters are changed in the project panel or the material graph. On this slide, we're looking at a screenshot of our project panel with a RealCloth material selected and the warp dropdown open. Here you can see some of the parameters you can control for each fiber direction. These same parameters are available for controlling your weft fibers as well. Through the warp and weft dropdowns, you can control several elements of how your threads will appear as you work on your projects. However, if you are a KeyShot 9 Pro user, you can further edit your weave by selecting the Edit Weave Pattern button at the top of the Properties subtab. You can see that right here. Here you'll have greater control over thread appearance. You'll be able to customize thread patterns by interacting with the weave graphic in the center of the window, and you'll be able to select from 9 different preset weave options from the preset dropdown at the top right of the window. Before I jump into KeyShot to show you how to control your RealCloth applications, I want to take a quick sidestep and touch on UV unwrapping. In order to achieve successful results with RealCloth applications, you'll need to ensure that your models have been properly UV mapped. If not, you'll definitely experience discrepancies with your applications. Incorrectly mapped UVs typically result in weave patterns being stretched in unwanted ways, shifts in pattern direction, as well as flyaway geometry mapping issues due to the fact that flyaways are entirely dependent on the underlying weave pattern. Previously, UV unwrapping was dependent on your modeling software of choice. However, in KeyShot 9.1, UV unwrapping has been added in program to allow you to unwrap models from software such as SolidWorks that don't have integrated UV unwrap functions in them. And all right, with that said, let's jump into KeyShot for a moment, and I will show you how to unwrap a model in program. Let me open up KeyShot. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this if you've seen our UV unwrapping tutorial on YouTube. I've UV unwrapped this cutting board right here so that the ply would map correctly in the manner that I wanted to. I'm gonna open up another file, which is the same file, but it is a blank version, so I can kind of show you how to go about doing this. This is a SolidWorks file, which is why I've kept it a little bit simpler for this tutorial. Right off the bat, SolidWorks has some strange geometry issues with the tessellation when it comes in, so you need to retessellate your objects right off the bat. I'll actually show you what it looks like. Here, our unwrap UV option, you can get to it by right-clicking or by going to the tools at the top. So I'm just going to go and unwrap UV real quick to show you what this looks like. And this is an issue because when you're creating different direction guides and seams, this stretch discrepancies going on here, it makes it a little difficult to keep everything going the way you want it to. So right off the bat, what you want to do is actually retessellate in the tool menu. And you don't want to go too crazy with the retessellation because it'll create so many triangles that it'll be difficult to deal with, but you also don't want to go too light. I'm actually going to start with 0.2 and we'll take a peek at what that looks like. So right off the bat, you can see that's a lot better. We're getting a little patterning going on, but it's a lot better than the previous look you were seeing where everything was stretched around these radiuses and these circles. I'm going to actually go with 0.2. I'm going to apply that. Done. And then from here, you would need to separate your surfaces so that you can map your UVs accordingly. So I'm going to go ahead and separate my surfaces, and you can just choose all the surfaces you'd like to split those surfaces in one go, and then apply. That's the easiest way to keep your workflow moving. And then from this point is when you'll start UV mapping. I'm actually going to unwrap this side piece. And this is a fairly simple piece. It's 90 degrees. Sometimes you're going to want to use multiple seams. Sometimes you can get away with one. In this instance, you can get away with one. I've tried doing it both ways. So what I'll go ahead and do is I'll add a seam, and I'm going to choose a center point right here. and then I'll go ahead and click the check mark to assign that seam. And now I need to add a direction guide for the direction that I actually want my pattern to follow. And since I want the ply edge to actually wrap around the outside, similar to what it would look like if it was cut on a bandsaw, I'm going to go ahead and set my direction guide. I'm going to pick a point right off that seam, and then I'm going to start selecting points. And you can see that the program already kind of anticipated what I'm doing here. So I'm going to go ahead and just follow that around, finish unwrapping that. And then once I'm done, I hit the check mark, and then I can go ahead and select by flood filling. You see how flood fill is selected. I can flood fill the part that's going to be UV unwrapped. And then from this point, I can unwrap, and you can see the UVs have been mapped in the manner that I'd like them to. I can go ahead and apply that. And then now we have a UV wrapped correctly piece around the side. So that's essentially what UV unwrapping is. You do something similar to the front. Let me unwrap UV again. If you're looking at the top surface, in this case, I would set the seam to be the exterior, but I can just set a direction guide too. And it really depends on which direction you want your grain to go. In this case, I would want my grain to travel in this manner. So I would select something along these lines right about here. And then you can see that the dotted line anticipates the direction, and I can set my direction guide there. So that'll determine how my UVs are going to be mapped in the end. And, like a cooking show over here, I'll go ahead and pull that out again. And this is the end product. And if I click on this and you look at the textures, I have it set to UV. So once you've actually mapped your UVs, you can go ahead and change your mapping type to UV, and you should have an accurately mapped texture due to your UVs. And then here you can actually adjust width, height, make everything meet up. And the less seams you have, the easier it's going to be to have your material meet up flawlessly, because there's a seam that's actually right along the front here, but it's nearly imperceptible. I can't actually see it from here. Having less seams makes it a lot easier, especially when the UVs wrap entirely around it, because the program automatically kind of realizes that it's one component. All right, let me open up the RealCloth scene now that we talked about UVs, and let's talk about working with our RealCloth. So here is a cloth that I've applied RealCloth to already. I'm going to actually apply a different part of RealCloth. Let's just drag and drop. Let's drag and drop one of these black ones. So this has been UV mapped already. So you can see that around the surface curvatures, it's naturally mapping rather than becoming distorted. The flyaways themselves are also still up there, but they're a little long right now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change some parameters here. You can see on the project panel, you have access to your mapping type, your warp, your weft, and your geometry. The flyaways are sticking up here. We can control that, but I'm going to actually go into the material graph. I like working from the material graph. The node-based editor makes things a little bit easier, and you can do things you can't do inside of the project panel. So we'll go ahead and double click our RealCloth, and I'm going to close. Actually, let's open Edit Weave Pattern. This Edit Weave Pattern is really cool. If you're a KeyShot Pro user, you can hear the presets that you can choose from along the right side. This is the preset dropdown, and you can also interact with the weave pattern to create some really interesting effects that are more customized and unique to what you're actually going for. I'm going to go ahead and make those a little less wide, make some light pass through it. And I'm going to apply that. And then you can also mess with your scale. If you noticed the scale previously is a little large. It's still believable, but it's a little large, so I can reduce the scale overall. And another thing you'll notice is that the geometry button, the execute geometry icon, has popped up over here. Every time you make an adjustment, you need to hit that. Otherwise, it's not going to accurately map your flyaways to your material. All that geometry that's popping out is determined on the weave pattern. So by doing that, it reallocates your flyaways to the actual weave that you've adjusted. So there we go. There's a much tighter weave pattern. The scale dropped. You notice that the flyaways kind of shortened a little bit because the scale changed. And then if you look over here, this is how you control your flyaways. I have them enabled. You can disable them as well. But this is where you'd control them. You change the density and length and radius and all that. So it's a really useful tool. And you can get a lot of customization out of it. And you can even create metal meshes or nylons. Got a bunch of drag and drop materials over here for you to start working with. But this is really where you're going to get the majority of your customization in here. And that edit weave pattern is going to allow you to create some unique patterns that you don't have in other ways. One thing that I do want to bring attention to is that when you're working with really tight patterns, in photography, you get something called moire patterns, and that happens here as well. Basically, it's the grid of the camera, or in this case, the program, not quite meeting up with the grid that you're seeing on the pattern, and it creates this kind of grid-like distortion effect. And you can solve that by cranking up your anti-aliasing. You don't need to go too much at the beginning, but start at like 1 and then go up from there to see if you're getting those effects. Usually if the pattern's like somewhat large like this, you're not going to experience that. But if you're getting really tight patterns or you're far away from your material, that is something that you're most likely going to encounter. And that anti-aliasing is how you're going to be able to combat that. So let me pause this. Let's go back in. All right, so during that last demo, we just took a peek at the geometry drop-down parameters that allow you to control your flyaway effects on RealCloth applications. Flyaways, as I mentioned, are the fibers that protrude from RealCloth surfaces, which help create an added level of realism on your cloth renderings. These fibers are entirely dependent on the threads below because they adopt the location and color information from the weave patterns that you've created. As you just saw, after making my adjustments, I had to execute my geometry nodes to update my scene. This is something that you'll be doing regularly in order to preview your adjustments in the real-time window. Because both Flyaways and Fuzz are actual geometry, you'll need to execute your geometry nodes after each adjustment you make while working with either. For both Flyaways and Fuzz, there are several options at your disposal for updating geometry. The first is by selecting the geometry update icon, which appears at the top right of the real-time window, which you just saw me do in our little demo. And that applies to both Fuzz and RealCloth Flyaways. The second is within the material graph. With your RealCloth material or Fuzz application selected, you can update geometry by scrolling to the bottom of the property subtab in the graph and selecting the execute geometry button. This is true for both Flyaways and Fuzz. However, you can also execute Flyaway geometry from the geometry dropdown in the project panel, which you cannot do for Fuzz applications. Fuzz applications have to be done from the material graph. And finally, when working with Fuzz, you can use the Alt-G command. And I recommend using the Alt-G command for Fuzz over other options because it allows you to trigger your updates from any window, and that really helps speed up your workflow as a whole. Fuzz, which I just brought up, is another incredible new feature Luxion has introduced in KeyShot 9. As Soren mentioned earlier, Fuzz was built off the same architecture that was used to create RealCloth Flyaways, but can be used as a standalone geometry application on any base material. The Fuzz itself can also have a variety of materials applied to it, meaning that it is not constrained by the underlying material the way Flyaways are. Using Fuzz geometry shader allows you to create cloth-like surface effects on virtually any material you've applied within your scene. And not only can Fuzz be used to make cloth-like materials, but its flexibility allows you to create a significantly larger array of strand-like effects, from lawn grass to fine hairs on fruits or insects. You can create like plasma-like strands. There's the sky's the limit, really. Here you can see a variety of Fuzz applications made by some of the power users. And you can see like we have the Fuzz from a spider. It's a creepy looking spider. I like it. But we also have Fuzz found on like a succulent, grass in a field, this plasma-like illuminated strands, and then some more natural applications up here. Another aspect of note regarding the Fuzz feature is that it does not require properly mapped UVs to have a successful application. This makes it a great alternative in soft goods applications for individuals struggling with UV mapping or for users who are not interested in doing so. Fuzz applies to any material and is able by default to map in a perpendicular manner over surface curvatures. For applications that require strands to protrude in specific directions or in specific patterns, control over these elements can be achieved through the material graph, which I'll demo in a moment. It's also important to note that both Flyaways and Fuzz, normals should be oriented in the direction you wish strands to protrude from. If your normals are incorrectly mapped, you can flip the direction by checking the flip normal box in either the geometry dropdown for Flyaways or just above the appearance dropdown for Fuzz. And you can find a flip normals checkbox in both the materials tab and material graph when working with RealCloth, but can only access the flip normal function for Fuzz in the material graph. Along with the increased flexibility and usage in material assignment, you also have increased control over patterning, density, and length using texture inputs. Applying texture maps to fuzz node inputs allows you to create a variety of effects, such as brush bristles or embossed and debossed logos using color maps with the direction input will also allow you to control direction effects that can lend to an added level of realism depending on your given application. On the bottom here, you can see an example of the material graph of how a direction texture would affect a plane with fuzz applied to the surface. That image you see below is from our KeyShot manual online, which I highly recommend taking a look at. If you ever have questions about features or troubleshooting an issue, the manual is a great place to start, and more often than not, will have the answer you are looking for. Let me jump in and show you how to control those texture inputs very quickly here. Again, if you've were in there for our Fuzz webinar, this will be a familiar sight to you. Basically, all I've done here is I've taken a plane and applied Fuzz to it. And in this case, I used a label from our textures tab to create this KeyShot logo. And let me open up the material graph so you can take a peek at what's going on here. Let me stretch this out and close that a bit. So here we have our texture inputs right here, and we have some texture maps that I've pulled from the texture panel. And if you open up this file from the ones that we provided on the agenda page, these are already applied to it. I believe I actually connected all of them so that they would stay in there. If they're not there for some reason, you can just grab them from the texture tab here in the library panel. But essentially, what's going on here is that the way texture inputs work, anything that's white, you're getting the full parameter set that you've set inside of your parameters. So if I double click this, white means that it's applying all of this at 100%. If you're black, it's the opposite. It's the negative. It removes that effect entirely. So if you have a stark contrast, such as this right here, the black areas are an absence of the effect, while the white areas are the entirety of the effect, versus like a texture map down here, like a linear gradient, that's going to create a gradual effect rather than such a harsh effect. Now, if you, this is like a embossed logo effect with the fuzz over here. But if I want to create a deboss logo effect, I would need a black, but you don't actually need to pull in the black bump map. You can just click on the connection point between the inputs, right click, hit utilities, and do a invert color. And when you invert that color, and again, I'm going to have to update my geometry because I've just changed how the geometry is affecting my model, it's going to reverse it. And now we're going to have a debossed effect where the actual area with the logo is absent of the effect in its entirety, while the surrounding areas have the effect at 100%. So that's like how you would see the render weekly sign that I believe Esben did, and several other things that Esben's done with our logo as well. This is kind of the effect that you would go under, and you can assign whatever material to the base material that you want to sign through. So if the idea is for it to look like some sort of rubberized stamp material, that is very possible. Let me delete this real quick. If you're looking at length textures, we can use this right here so I can show you how a gradated texture looks. Again, I have to update my geometry. And you can see here, there's a gradation in how my fuzz is affecting my plane. And you can see, again, white to black. A little trick if you want to isolate the node that you're working with, you select your node that you're working with and you hit C. And that'll isolate that area so you can actually see the effect going on underneath it. And you can see black, pure black is all the way over here, pure white is all the way over here, and how that actually affects our surface. Same concept as how density texture is affected. So that's a little trick to being able to see what's going on and isolate your actual texture map that you're applying. Now, another fun thing is the direction texture. So if you're creating some sort of like brush bristle, or you want the surface of some fuzzy surface to react in a unique way, you can create a texture map using normals so that your surface has these effects that kind of cause the direction to change. Let me actually scale this up. bam. So you can see at the end there. So if you look from the side, I kind of have the randomness up so it feels more natural. Let me see if I can turn that down. Randomness down, and we'll update again. And that should kind of straighten things out for you there. So you can see here that the direction is shifting across the entire object, much like that density texture I showed you in the actual slides we were looking at. That allows you to control the surface effects, so you can create swirling patterns, whatever you want, but using a normal map is the best way to approach that. And again, if you hit C, you can see how the colors below are affecting the pattern in which they're shifting. So that's another really useful tip for customizing how your fuzz affects the surface of an object that you've applied it to. Very fun tool. You can create all kinds of things. I do recommend playing with it. I've seen some incredible things occur, render weekly and everything, but it is a really fun tool. So let's jump back in here. Now, while we were discussing fuzz, I'd like to bring attention to an issue I've experienced while working with the feature. In some instances, adjusting the density slider has not yielded my desired density. You may experience this as well, depending on the scale or type of fuzz application you've worked with. Through some experimentation, I've noticed that both the randomness and segment sliders may inadvertently affect the overall perception of surface fuzz density on a given material. When randomness is higher, it causes some fibers to shift direction in a manner that reverses their direction entirely and causes them to not be visible from the front of the material. This may cause the fuzz application to look less dense overall. If you look at the images on this page, you'll notice two examples. They both share the same settings other than randomness. On the first image at the top, randomness is set to 0.2, while the second is set to 2. And this is actually front and back. The normals are in different directions. And you can see here, it's almost the same because there's so many fibers that are actually protruding through the surface backwards. So that's definitely something to note. You can clearly see that with that low randomness settings, no fibers are visible from the back on the top. And hopefully that bit of information has helped you kind of combat those density discrepancies that you might experience in the future. Now that we've discussed two of our biggest features in the KeyShot 9 release, let's take a minute and talk about scanned materials for use in KeyShot projects. Two of the big companies that have developed scanning equipment are Pantone with the X-Rite TAC7 machine and Vizu. We currently use both here at Luxion headquarters and have used them to scan many sample materials from textiles to plastics and corrugated cardboard. Both scanners capture and store color, texture, gloss, and other surface appearance information, and that can be used within KeyShot for project-specific material applications. We currently have several scan material options available in KeyShot Cloud and are planning on adding many more. There are also a number of third-party resources you can utilize to obtain scan materials as well. One of those being the xrite.com sample library that has a couple examples that you can download and use for samples for yourself. And just go ahead and if you're in the KeyShot Cloud, you type in X-Rite or Vizu, you'll see those pop up, or AXF as well. You'll see those scan materials pop up. All right, the last two things I'd like to cover today are configurators and XRs for use as design decision tools. Both can be used to create engaging product visuals for use in presentations, design reviews, and point of sale across desktop and mobile platforms. They serve as an incredible tool to not only communicate value to internal and external stakeholders, but also serve as a clear and concise method for communicating design expectations to manufacturers and other development partners. For users of KeyShot Pro, Configurator can be set up in program through the Configurator wizard, which is located on the far right of the ribbon at the top. From here, you're able to set up Configurator presentations and can create model sets as well as assign multi-materials if you have not already done so in the program window. Using Configurator allows you to showcase potential unit variations as well as different colorway and label options, making communicating design intent super simple and efficient. And let me go ahead and open up one of the configurators we've made here at Luxion of a toaster. Right off the bat, you can see that we have some model sets, different knobs and different handles. I've actually already set up this configurator. So you can see down here, there is a presentation option, which wouldn't exist unless the configurator is set up. So at the top here, you have your configurator wizard. You click on the configurator wizard and it's going to take you into the configurator window. And from here, you're going to be able to set up your configurator. If you have not already set up your model sets and your multi-materials, that's fine. You can do that from in here. I personally like to have them all set up beforehand. It just, for me, makes it a lot easier, but you can do it either way. It really entirely depends up to you. Here you have the option to select geometry from the scene to create your parent models, or I can select existing model sets, which I've done. And here you can see toaster. You'd hit next. Once you have that, you'd be able to select from existing model sets again, or from geometry from the scene. And then you, so on and so forth. You follow through this process and be able to select all the different things you want. Your studios, if you have different studios and environments, you can do that as well. And then you can customize the layout. Like, you have a lot of controls here to make really interesting custom layouts for your configurators. It's a pretty powerful tool, in my opinion. And then a summary of all the options you've already made. And then you can preview it by hitting this preview button up here, or you can just go into presentation mode. I'm going to actually close out of this and go into presentation mode from the bottom. And then you can kind of see what a configurator looks like. This is a really basic one, but here we have our model, and you can manipulate it. You can rotate it. It's got all the color and lighting information. It's essentially working like KeyShot, but as a viewer, as a standalone, where you can't actually be applying materials in it, but it's powered by the same architecture that's powering KeyShot. So over here, I can actually zoom in, and you can see that I have a radius and a chamfer knob, so you can choose between those. I can show that to a manufacturer or show that to a stakeholder. Same thing with the handles. I can make my handles match with a chamfered edge over here. My body, I have colorway options. It's really powerful. The same thing with your accents. I can change between warm, textured, that'll change my accents of my actual components. And then my studios as well, I can choose between those. And this is really, really a powerful tool. You can put this on the web. You can send this individually. If they have KeyShot, they can open it up from KeyShot. So I'm gonna go ahead and exit that. We'll pause. And we'll go back over here for a moment. Lastly, let's quickly talk about KeyShot XR. XR is an add-on feature that is available through the KeyShot XR output if the KeyShot XR add-on is installed. XR outputs are a great way to deliver 360-degree touch-enabled interactive viewing of rendered models. They can be used to showcase high-quality product visuals across desktop and mobile devices, and can be extraordinarily useful when used in product portfolios, presentations, or design reviews. And I'm actually going to jump onto our website for a moment and show you some of the XRs we have up there, so you can get an idea of like a real-world application. So let me just open up Chrome real quick. And here you can see our keyshot.com/web. And this is talking about KeyShot XR and our web configurator. And you can go on this website, learn a little bit more about them, as well as play around with some of our configurators and XRs that we have set up. You can actually open, here's one of our configurators. You can see all the different things you can change. And we have a few more down here, including an Under Armour sneaker and this really cool vacuum. But so we're talking about XRs for the moment, and XRs are fun because they're an interactive graphic. I can rotate a model, I can change the angle, I can see different elements of it. One thing to take into account right now, I haven't zoomed in. So it's just rendering all the different angles at this view. However, if you want to add a zoom function, which you can see here, I'm actually getting closer to the model, significantly closer to the model. Every single stage that it's closer, it's going to have to render all those views out. So adding the zoom is going to increase your render time. So do take that into account. If it's important that you're able to zoom in to a degree, it will take longer. If it's not important and you want speed, then I would recommend just not using that and keeping it at a distance. It's still an extremely useful tool that you can see everything that's going on. So it's really a matter of personal preference and time on turnaround that you have going on. We have some more over here. You can create these exploded views as it rotates. You can add, you can take animations and turn them into XRs. It's a pretty incredible tool. And I recommend you jump on the website here at keyshot.com/web, take a minute and run around these guys. I did include the toaster configurator in the files, but this gives you a little bit more variety to choose from. So don't hesitate to drop in here. And with that said, Thank you for sticking around with me, everyone. That's it for our RealCloth and Fuzz presentation portion. And let's go ahead and open it up for some Q&A and answer some questions.
Great, thank you. And one thing to mention, one of the big things that Cream people use a lot for the configurator is when they're doing multi-materials for things like scan materials. If they want to show, for example, a shoe or a garment and the different variations, the configurator and viewer are a great way to do that. One customer is asking if you can open this with the free KeyShot viewer. You can. So on the website, I don't know if you want to bring it up real quick.
Yeah, let me pull it up.
The free KeyShot viewer is available, and so you can actually save out your configurations in real time and push those out to people. So a lot of times people are using that for example, setting up the different model sets or multi-materials, pushing it to a customer who can then download that with the free viewer and then see what those different options are. So it gives you a chance to give them a real-time view without having to kind of give them the full power of KeyShot or kind of being able to edit it. So you sort of are controlling what they can see. Obviously, you can also output that out to the web configurator as well if you don't want to give them the free viewer. So I believe that answers the question. A couple questions about Fuzz sort of shapes that I'll answer. You can jump in as well. Kareem, I know you want to bring up sort of the Fuzz option for randomness. So with the Fuzz, you can control the length variation and the randomness, and so you can sort of control, in a sense, the shape and the ability of the Fuzz, but you can't actually art direct the sort of Fuzz itself. So you couldn't, for example, say, have all the Fuzz have like a hook-like shape. So the controls are in there for the Fuzz, but they are limited in sort of the specificity of the control.
Yeah, it's limited, but you can definitely control how straight, how crazy they're going. Like as of now, you can see that a lot of these segments are kind of moving around pretty naturally. If you imagine like a bristle that's been used quite a bit, how they kind of go off in different directions. So that randomness kind of helps with that. The amount of segments you have also will increase. Segments, you can see here all these different little kinks and turns that are going on. That's going to affect that. So you can control that. You can also control whether these are capped off in a radius or straight across the top with the ribbon or the cylinder. If I switch it over to cylinder, you can see how now we have a very flat top, and that's going to alter how it's perceived at a distance as well. So there is some control over that, but yes, you aren't going to be able to create like a hooked fly or a fuzz fiber. That's we don't have that control over it yet.
One person's asking the ability to render knits. It is something that we are currently working on. So obviously RealCloth with its woven materials is sort of step one for KeyShot 9, but definitely stay tuned in KeyShot 10 for even more advancements on this front. One person's asking, how do you like to create sort of your texture maps and your color maps to drive that? What do you use? I'm assuming you use Photoshop in your case.
Yeah, I use Photoshop. Photoshop or Illustrator for me is the easiest way to do it. It's what I've had the most experience with. And actually, I want to bring up something real quick too. You can actually stack several textures together to create unique effects as well. So that's something to think about. Like you can see here that there's a texture going on from the texture map, the linear gradient, as well as a gradation, as well as the logo as well. So that's something else to consider.
Yes, and we also have example files. When you first load up, if you want to bring up the walk, excuse me, the walk window, Kareem, in KeyShot, we have example files on there as well that you can go and look at Fuzz and look at RealCloth. And someone else was asking about KeyShot HD versus KeyShot Pro. There are RealCloth examples inside of KeyShot as well as on the cloud. And so you can go and pull down and utilize any RealCloth in KeyShot HD. What you can't do is edit the weave pattern. So that is a pro feature, the ability to actually go in and edit the weave pattern, which Kareem was showing earlier. Yeah. One person's asking, sending an XR to a teammate. Yes, an XR is actually it's a HTML file essentially coming out with rendered images. So at that point, you can send it to anyone. There's no need to download. The KeyShot viewer is actually KeyShot under the hood, so it's actually a separate install and download. XR and Web Configurator basically can work with any browsers such as Chrome or Safari. And it looks like that is, are there additional, Yes, there will be. Well, we will always continue to add additional RealCloth and Fuzz to the library as we go. And if you want to bring up real quick, Kareem, and show them where the RealCloth files are in the library.
Yeah, let me pull up the RealCloth.
And
Yeah, so if you,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say if you come here to the materials tab in the library panel, and then you select RealCloth, right there, you can even select between your meshes, your satin, and your twill. Right off the bat, these are some drag and drop options that you have, and you can come up with some really cool effects just off the drag and drop options, and what you can do from the project panel if you're not a pro user.
Yes, and so and we'll people continue to add them into the cloud, but yeah, the best way to kind of really experiment with it is, honestly, I find, is just do what Kareem's doing and just kind of drag and drop it, and then kind of play around with different settings, and you can kind of get a feel for what you can do. One question is getting white colored fuzz. It can kind of turn out gray a little bit sometimes. That's generally because of the directional lighting. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Kareem.
No, yeah, lighting is going to play a really big effect in the color perception of the fuzz, of the flyaways. And you got to be aware too that the flyaways, since they are adopting the color information of the weave itself underneath it, they may not be a pure white unless that's the material that's underneath it. Go ahead.
I was saying, because it's actually a procedural mesh, and so it's actually, there's space in it. The light's not reflecting on it like it's a hard surface the way you would with sort of a flat material. So you want to make sure that if it is white, that you have sort of directional light on that versus sort of sort of soaking it in from outside.
Yeah, and I've noticed too that if you get a little carried away with the amount of fuzz that's on the surface or the brightness of the light, sometimes the fuzz will end up looking like hot spots or fireflies. It gives it a kind of a noise. So take that into account too if you're going too bright.
So you can change the gradient of each individual strand of fuzz. So you can drive the gradient of the overall fuzz, but not on a per strand level.
Yeah. I think if you apply a gradient to the actual fiber, that gradient will go across all the fuzz. If you actually go into our fuzz application up here and you drop in the lawn grass, or is it lawn grass? Yes, the lawn grass. There's like a tall one as well. And you drop that on and pull the scale down. You can actually, here we go, tall dry grass fuzz. Let's see if that gives me, really just depends on the scale here. All right, well, but yeah, if you pull that on there, you can kind of see how the grass reacts. There's a gradient that is the same on each of the fibers across all the fibers, but you cannot control individual fibers.
Okay, and so we're at the top of the hour here, so we will wrap it up. I will take the screen from you,
yep.
And then we will go through some winners here. So first on our, can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, I got you over here.
Great. So for the Shader Ball channel, these are our top three. Thomas Lee Design, Colin Jin, and Oliver Peretta. They're the top three. So at 3 p.m. today on Render Weekly, you can go and find out who the winner is. Some folks were asking how to join the contest. If you go to Render Weekly on Instagram or renderweekly.com, you can see how basically you can kind of get instructions and then use the hashtag RW KeyShot World to enter your submission. That's all you have to do. So congratulations to those three for being our finalists, and we'll find out at 3 p.m. today who gets the license. In addition, we also have a wonderful prize from the folks at Stanley Black & Decker, DeWalt walkie-talkie and the Craftsman drill set. And the winner of that is Rob Adams from Fossil. He is the winner of the Stanley Black & Decker giveaway. So we will follow up with you directly, Rob, and get you additional information on how to get that prize. And so I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Reminder, we'll have another session tomorrow at 10 a.m. that will go through model sets and studios and some additional information on multi-materials. And thank you everyone for joining. Any parting words for us here, Kareem?
Yeah, thanks everyone for stopping in. Please feel free to connect with me directly via email at kareem@luxion.com or on my LinkedIn at Kareem Merchant. If you have questions we didn't get to or you think of something later, not a problem at all. And I did want to say that all these rendered KeyShot balls are amazing. I've been seeing some crazy stuff, so I love it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone so much. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.